Did you touch my purse with those filthy hands? Do you have any idea how much that costs? The voice was not merely a sound, it was a weapon, a shard of sonic ice hurled across the sophisticated, hushed atmosphere of Le Pearl restaurant. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed, a voice that expected the world to rearrange itself to its owner's whims. It was the voice of Victoria Blackwood, and it sliced through the polite murmurs and the soft, tinkling piano music like a razor, instantly silencing every conversation, freezing every gesture. 20-6-year-old Daniel Santos stood motionless, beside table 17, a silver tray held steady in his left hand. He had just used it to serve the billionaire heiress her dinner, a meticulously arranged plate of seared scallops with a truffle reduction that cost, by itself, more than his weekly rent. His calm dark eyes, the color of strong coffee, contrasted sharply with the sudden, ugly chaos that had erupted around him. Victoria's Hermes Birkin bag, a crocodile skin monstrosity that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, had slipped from the arm of her velvet-upholstered chair just as Daniel was passing by. His reflexes, honed by years of athletic grace and the split-second timing required of a high-end waiter, had kicked in. He had moved without thinking, his hand shooting out to catch the obscenely expensive accessory just inches before it hit the polished marble floor. It was a gesture of pure, instinctual kindness, of professional diligence, a gesture that was now being twisted into a public, humiliating crucifixion. "Just look at him," Victoria continued, her voice rising in pitch, a shrill, ugly sound that grated on the nerves. She pointed a long manicured finger at Daniel, a finger adorned with a diamond the size of a robin's egg. She was not speaking to him, but to the room, to her audience. She was performing. He's probably never even seen a bag that costs more than his 10-year salary, and now he's drooling, wondering what it would be like to own something like this. The entitlement of these people is simply staggering. Le Pearl, a temple of gastronomy considered one of the 5 most exclusive and expensive restaurants in New York City, had never witnessed such a raw, embarrassing scene. It was a place where discretion was the most valuable item on the menu, where the wealthy and powerful came to be insulated from the grubby realities of the world. Now, that insulation had been violently breached. Multimillionaire customers put down their sterling silver cutlery, their expressions a mixture of shock and a certain morbid curiosity. High-powered executives, who had been conducting hushed, important business deals over the phone, stopped talking. Even the pianist, a seasoned professional, accustomed to being ignored, hesitated on the keys, the gentle melody of a Debussy arabesque faltering into a dissonant silence. Daniel had only been working at Le Pearl for 3 months, a relatively new face in a sea of veteran staff, but all the employees, from the bussers to the sommeliers, already knew his story, or at least, the version of it he had allowed them to know. They knew he was a graduate of Columbia University's prestigious business school, with top honors. They knew he had lost his promising corporate job at a high-powered investment bank after reporting financial irregularities he had discovered at his former company, a whistleblower, a man of integrity, and now, while looking for a new opportunity in a financial world that had blacklisted him for his honesty, he was waiting tables, working double shifts, to pay the rent on his small, cramped apartment in Brooklyn. "Mrs. Blackwood," Daniel said for the first time, his voice low but firm, a steady, quiet rock in the turbulent sea of her hysteria. "I apologize if I disturbed you. I was simply trying to prevent your purse from falling." Victoria let out a short, sharp, contemptuous laugh. She turned to the other customers, her eyes sweeping the room, inviting them to share in her outrage, in her superiority. "Tried to stop it from falling," she sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or did you try to steal it? Everyone knows that people like you simply can't resist when they see something valuable. It's in your nature." The silence that followed that final, ugly, racist remark was deafening. It was a thick, heavy, uncomfortable silence, filled with the unspoken thoughts of everyone in the room. Daniel felt the weight of every gaze on him. Some were sympathetic. He could see the faces of some of the other staff, the busboys, the kitchen hands, were tight with a shared, silent anger. Some of the customers looked curious. Their expressions, those of people watching a particularly dramatic reality television show. Many, perhaps most, simply looked embarrassed, their eyes darting away, not wanting to be involved, not wanting to be tainted by this raw, unpleasant display of prejudice. But there was something different in Daniel's eyes, something that didn't fit the scene. There was no fear, there was no anger, there was no shame, there was only a profound, unshakable serenity. It was the serenity that only exists in those who have weathered far worse storms, who have faced far more dangerous adversaries, and who have discovered in the crucible of their own private battles that they possess the tools not only to survive, but to thrive. Actually, Daniel replied, his voice still calm, still measured. He adjusted the knot of his simple, black tie, a gesture of such natural, unconscious elegance that it made some of the more observant customers frown in puzzlement. People like me learn, very early on, that true value can't be carried in a bag. Victoria stopped laughing. The smile on her perfectly made-up face froze, then began to curdle. Something in his tone of voice, in his upright, unapologetic posture, in the way he did not lower his eyes, not even for a second, made her realize, with a sudden, unpleasant jolt, that she might have seriously, catastrophically, underestimated the person she was so gleefully trying to humiliate there. In the center of that opulent, silent room, in front of all those looks of contempt and curiosity and pity, Daniel Santos stood firm, a small, solitary island of calm in a sea of turmoil. He stood like someone guarding a secret so powerful, so potent, that it could only be revealed at the perfect, calculated, and devastatingly appropriate time. Victoria Blackwood was not accustomed to being contradicted. She was not accustomed to being challenged, and she was certainly, most definitely, not accustomed to being contradicted and challenged by someone she considered to be so far beneath her, so utterly insignificant in the grand, gilded tapestry of her life, that he might as well have been a piece of furniture. Daniel's quiet, philosophical response about true value had caught her completely off guard. A small, sharp stone thrown against the bulletproof glass of her arrogance. But it did not chasten her. It only fueled her elitist, racist fury, even more. "Listen here, waiter," she said, her voice now cutting through the air like a whip. She rose from her chair, a slow, deliberate movement designed to emphasize her height, her power, her social dominance. "You think you can lecture me? Me, I move more money in a single afternoon than you will see in your entire pathetic little life." Daniel remained motionless, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, those calm, dark, intelligent eyes, revealed something that Victoria couldn't quite decipher. There was a stillness there, a profound, unshakable calmness that bothered her deeply. It was as if he knew something she didn't. It was as if he was watching her, studying her with the detached, analytical curiosity of a scientist observing a particularly interesting and predictable specimen manager. Victoria shouted, her voice now a shrill, imperious command. She slammed her hand down on the table, making the fine, delicate cutlery clatter and jump. "I want this incompetent, impertinent person fired, immediately, and I want to know how. A place like La Pearl, a place that prides itself on its exclusivity, on its standards, allows people like this to work here." Richard Payton, the general manager of La Pearl, a man whose entire professional life was a delicate, high-wire balancing act of placating the egos of the rich and powerful, approached the table quickly. His face was pale with a nervous, professional dread. His hands were clasped behind his back, a desperate attempt to conceal their trembling. Victoria Blackwood was not just any wealthy, demanding customer. She was the daughter, the sole heiress, of Harrison Blackwood, one of the largest, most ruthless, and most powerful real estate moguls in the United States. Harrison Blackwood owned 3 of the skyscrapers on the very same avenue where La Pearl was located. He was, in a very real sense, their landlord, and he was not a man to be trifled with. "Mrs. Blackwood, I do apologize, most sincerely, for any inconvenience, for any disturbance," Richard Payton muttered, his voice a low, placating murmur. He was sweating visibly, small beads of perspiration forming on his upper lip. "I am sure we can resolve this matter. Discreetly, discreetly." Victoria laughed, that same ugly, contemptuous sound. "There is nothing discreet about being disrespected, being lectured, by an insignificant minimum-wage employee. Look at him." She spat, pointing at Daniel again, as if he were an inanimate object, a piece of trash that needed to be removed. "He probably came out of some slum in the Bronx, and now he thinks he can talk to me, to a Blackwood, as an equal." The racist, classist words echoed through the nascent restaurant, causing several of the customers to look away, to stare down at their plates, their faces flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and a quiet, complicit shame. But Daniel showed no sign of emotional distress. There was no flicker of anger, no hint of hurt in his calm, steady gaze. In fact, something strange, something almost imperceptible, happened. A tiny, fleeting smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Ma'am, I truly do apologize if my attempt to help you caused this misunderstanding, Daniel said, his voice maintaining a tone of such profound, unwavering respect that it contrasted, sharply, almost absurdly, with Victoria's escalating hysteria. Perhaps it would be best if I were to step aside now, and allow another server to take care of your table for the remainder of the evening. Now you want to run away? Victoria sneered, sensing a victory. Typical when the going gets tough. People like you always run, you have no backbone, no character. It was then that Richard Peyton, the manager, noticed something that made him even more nervous than he already was. Daniel Santos was not behaving like an ordinary, terrified waiter who was about to lose his job. His posture, the way he spoke, the precise, elegant economy of his movements, even the way he held the silver tray, all of it showed a level of refined education, of quiet, confident self-possession that did not match the profile of the employees they normally hired for this position. Daniel, Richard Peyton muttered discreetly, trying to de-escalate the situation, to get him out of the line of fire. Maybe you had better go to the kitchen for a few minutes, just until things cool down. But Daniel remained exactly where he was. He did not move, he did not flinch. Actually, Mr. Peyton, he said, his voice calm and clear, I think it would be interesting to clear up a few things. Right here, right now. Victoria laughed loudly, a triumphant, braying sound. She turned to the other customers, her arms spread wide, as if she were the star of a particularly satisfying theatrical performance. Listen to this, she announced to the room. He wants to clear things up. A waiter wanting to explain himself to a Blackwood. The audacity. It's interesting that you mentioned the surname, Daniel replied, his voice still impossibly unnervingly calm because, as it happens, I am very familiar with the Blackwood family's reputation. Especially, he added, his voice dropping slightly, taking on a new, sharper edge, when it comes to the questionable practices in their business dealings. Victoria's triumphant smile faltered for the first time. It wavered, then began to collapse. Something in Daniel's tone, the way he had said the words questionable practices with such a quiet, confident authority, sent a sudden cold chill down her spine. What are you talking about? She asked, but her voice had lost some of its previous arrogance. It was now tinged with a faint new note of uncertainty. Daniel adjusted his tie again, a slow, deliberate gesture that now seemed less like a nervous tic and more like a calculated, strategic move. It was as if he were an actor, a master of his craft, using a simple prop to build suspense, to command the stage. Well, ma'am, he said, his voice now taking on a conversational, almost friendly tone. Working in places like this, one gets to meet some very interesting people. High-powered executives, influential auditors, federal investigators, and they all love to talk, especially over a good meal. Richard Peyton frowned, a deep, worried crease forming between his eyebrows. There was something about the way Daniel was speaking, about the words he was choosing, that didn't fit at all with the profile of a waiter in financial difficulty. It was as if he were playing a role, a very convincing and very dangerous role. Are you threatening me? Victoria asked, and now her voice was trembling slightly. The hunter was suddenly, inexplicably, beginning to feel like the prey. Not at all, Daniel replied, and he offered her a genuinely cordial, almost charming, smile. I am simply observing that the world is a much smaller place than we often think. For example, he continued, his voice still casual, still conversational. Just 3 months ago, I had the pleasure of serving a table right over there, in the corner. He pointed discreetly with his chin to table 15, a secluded, private booth. The guest was a Mr. Marcus Thompson. From the Federal Audit Office, he was discussing, quite loudly I might add, certain ongoing investigations involving large construction companies that have a habit of overcharging for public works contracts. Victoria's blood ran cold. Marcus Thompson was the very same federal auditor who was currently in charge of the investigation into her father's company, an investigation that had the entire Blackwood family on edge. How could a simple, insignificant waiter possibly know that name? And just last week, Daniel continued, his voice as smooth and as cool as the polished marble floor. I had the pleasure of serving Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh. She was having dinner with her team, celebrating a recent victory, and they were discussing, in great detail, several ongoing cases of large-scale tax evasion, involving the use of offshore accounts and shell companies in certain tax havens. Victoria sat down, slowly, heavily, in her chair. Her face was losing its color, turning a pale pasty and healthy shade of gray. Walsh, Jennifer Walsh, was the very same federal prosecutor who had sent subpoenas to the entire Blackwood family just the previous month, demanding access to years of financial records. Who are you? She whispered, her voice now a raw, fearful croak, and Daniel finally smiled openly. A wide, brilliant, and utterly terrifying smile. And it was then that everyone in that silent watching room realized that something extraordinary, something impossible, was happening. That was not the smile of a humiliated, defeated waiter. It was the smile of a man who had been 3, 4, 5 steps ahead of his opponent during the entire, brutal conversation. I'm someone who learned a very, very valuable lesson when he was unfairly fired from a large investment bank 3 months ago, Daniel said, his voice now a low, powerful murmur. He slowly, deliberately, reached into the inside pocket of his crisp, white waiter's uniform. I learned that sometimes, you have to accept a humble position, you have to make yourself invisible, in order to be in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, with exactly the right people. The card he placed on the table, next to her half-eaten plate of scallops, made Victoria gasp audibly, a sharp, choked intake of breath. It was an FBI card. Economic Crimes Division. Name, Special Agent Daniel Santos. You see how small the world is, Miss Blackwood, Daniel said, his voice now completely transformed, all pretense of subservience gone, replaced by a cold, hard, professional authority. During these 3 months of waiting tables at your favorite restaurant, I have had the privilege of having access to the most interesting, most revealing, most incriminating conversations. Conversations between powerful people who would never ever suspect that a simple, invisible, black waiter could be documenting their every word, their every accidental admission, their every revealing, drunken slip of the tongue. The restaurant had become a silent, frozen tomb. Victoria stared at the small, innocuous piece of cardboard on the table as if it were a death sentence. And you know what else, Miss Blackwood? Daniel continued, leaning forward slightly, his voice a low, confidential, and utterly menacing whisper. Tonight, a very important person, a person of great wealth and influence, has just committed a very serious federal crime, right here in front of me, and in front of dozens of credible, high-profile witnesses. Every new humiliation, every racist, classist word that Victoria had hurled at him, was not only documented by a room full of eyewitnesses. It was now clear that it had been a direct, public, and incredibly foolish assault on an undercover federal agent. An agent who, it was now terrifyingly clear, had just received an unwitting public confession about her family's criminal activities, information that could, and would, completely and utterly, destroy the Blackwood empire. What that billionaire heiress, in her arrogance and her prejudice, didn't know, was that every single act of racial contempt, every word of arrogant dismissal, had been the last, final nail in the coffin of a criminal dynasty, a dynasty that was about to discover that underestimating the right person at the wrong time can cost you much, much more than just your money. It can cost you your freedom. What Victoria Blackwood, in her state of profound, world-shattering shock, couldn't possibly understand was that her public, racist, and deeply satisfying humiliation of a man she perceived as her inferior had been the last, crucial piece of a complex, meticulously constructed federal puzzle. A puzzle that Special Agent Daniel Santos had been painstakingly putting together for exactly 92 days. Agent Santos, a calm, familiar voice echoed from the small, almost invisible, device in his ear, a voice that was almost imperceptible to any casual observer. We have confirmed a high-quality audio and video recording of the entire incident. We have more than enough material to proceed. All teams are in position, awaiting your signal. Daniel kept his expression perfectly, professionally neutral, while Victoria remained frozen in her chair, her eyes still fixed on the FBI card on the table as if it were a venomous snake, coiled and ready to strike. The entire restaurant, once a vibrant hub of sophisticated chatter and clinking glasses, had become a silent, frozen chamber, with all the customers suspended in a state of rapt, fearful curiosity. They all sensed that they were witnessing something much bigger, much more significant than a simple, albeit ugly, customer complaint. Ms. Blackwood, Daniel said calmly, his voice now devoid of its earlier feigned subservience, replaced by a cool, professional authority. He picked up the FBI card and slipped it back into his pocket. I believe it would be in your best interest, and in the best interest of your family, to speak with me, privately, especially, he added, his voice dropping to a low, confidential tone, regarding the series of rather large bank transfers that your company made to a certain holding company in the Cayman Islands just last week." Victoria's face, which had been a pasty, unhealthy pale, now seemed to turn a shade of grey. Those transfers were top secret. They were known only to her father, and to the corporation's chief accountant. They were the very heart of the family's illegal offshore tax evasion scheme. How could an undercover agent, a man she had mistaken for a waiter, possibly know about transactions that not even the family's high-pressed powerful lawyers were privy to? You can't prove anything," she stammered, her voice a weak trembling leaf in the wind of his calm/unshakable confidence. Daniel smiled, a soft, almost pitying smile. "Actually, Ms. Blackwood, I can, you see, ma'am, during these 3 months of serving that table, right over there, in the corner." He pointed discreetly with his chin to table 15, the most secluded, most private booth in the entire restaurant. "I have had the distinct privilege of serving dinner to Mr. Theodore Blackwood, Jr., your younger brother, every Thursday night." Like clockwork, Victoria's blood ran cold. Theodore, her foolish, reckless, cocaine-addicted younger brother, the weak link in the family chain, the one her father had deliberately kept out of the main, sensitive parts of the business, precisely because of his dangerous, uncontrollable tendency to talk too much, especially when he was under the influence of his favorite vices. "Theodore loves to talk," Daniel continued, his voice maintaining that same respectful, educational tone that now sounded so eerie, so calculated, especially after his third, or fourth, martini. "He loves to brag about how clever the family is, about how they move money around to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. It's been a fascinating series of conversations, all about shell companies and offshore accounts, and even," he added, his gaze sharp and direct, "about how your company has been buying up land from poor rural minority communities for a fraction of its value, through a systematic campaign of legal intimidation and harassment." Richard Payton, the manager, who had been hovering nervously in the background, now discreetly backed away, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He realized, with a sickening lurch in his stomach, that he was witnessing something far, far beyond a simple customer complaint. He was witnessing the takedown of a criminal empire. Other restaurant employees, who had been watching from the relative safety of the kitchen doorway, were now trying to process the cinematic, unbelievable twist that was unfolding before their very eyes. "But what really impressed me," Daniel continued, his voice still calm, still conversational, as he discreetly removed a small, digital recorder from the inside pocket of his waiter's jacket, "were the conversations I overheard at table 12. That's where your Blackwood Industries chief accountant, a Mr. Marcus Hoffman, has dinner with his wife every Monday night, and he discusses, in great loving detail, how they have been falsifying environmental impact reports in order to obtain building permits in federally protected wetland areas." Victoria tried to stand, to flee, but her legs, her real, functioning legs, gave way beneath her. She sank back into her chair, her body trembling. That's entrapment," she hissed, the word a desperate, pathetic legal shield. "You can't use that information. It's illegal." "Entrapment," Daniel replied, his voice taking on the patient, pedagogical tone of a law professor, "would be if I had induced you, or your family, to commit these crimes. But you were all already committing them, with great enthusiasm. Long before I started serving you your sea bass, I just documented them." He held up the small, sophisticated recording device. "And I must say, the audio quality here at La Pearl is exceptional. Every word, every detail, every drunken, arrogant, accidental confession has been captured with a crystal, indictable clarity." At that moment a man in a discreet, perfectly tailored dark suit approached the table. He was tall, black, around 40 years old, with a posture that radiated a quiet, formidable, federal authority. Victoria recognized him immediately from the photographs in the financial newspapers. It was Special Agent James Washington, the feared and respected head of the FBI's Economic Crimes Division in New York. "Ms. Blackwood," Agent Washington said, his voice a low, calm, and utterly uncompromising baritone. He discreetly, but firmly, presented his ID. "I'm Agent Washington. I am Agent Santos's supervisor, and I would very much like to have a talk with you about some irregularities we've discovered in your family's business operations." "Operation Golden Facade," Daniel muttered, as if he were explaining the daily specials on the menu. "It was initiated 6 months ago, after we received a series of anonymous tips about systematic, long-term corruption involving Blackwood Industries. 3 months of preliminary investigation, followed by 3 months of direct infiltration. Victoria looked around the room desperately, her eyes darting from side to side, as if she were searching for an exit, for an escape route, for someone, anyone, who could save her. But the other customers, her peers, the other wealthy, powerful people in the room, all looked away. They were clearly, and wisely, uncomfortable with being associated with this sudden, public implosion. Some of them were already discreetly signaling to the waiters, asking for their checks, eager to flee the scene before they, too, were drawn into this widening vortex of criminality. The irony, of course, Daniel continued, his voice now tinged with a faint, almost imperceptible note of personal satisfaction, is that I really did need the job. I was, in fact, fired from my previous position in investment banking, after I reported a series of financial irregularities. Irregularities which, interestingly enough, involved the laundering of money for the very same corporation that I am now investigating. He smiled, a small, grim smile. The FBI offered me this undercover opportunity when they found out that I had extensive experience in both high finance and, from my college days, in high-end restaurant service. It was a perfect fit. Agent Washington nodded gravely. Agent Santos has been instrumental in this operation, he said, his voice full of a deep, professional respect. His ability to remain, as you so eloquently put it, invisible, while documenting hundreds of hours of private, incriminating conversations, has allowed us to build a solid, airtight case against your family's entire network of corruption. Every Thursday, Daniel explained to Victoria, who was now visibly shaking, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, your brother, Theodore, would arrive here at 8 p.m. sharp. Every Monday, your accountant, Marcus Hoffman, would have dinner with his wife and discuss, in detail, secrets he should never have revealed in public. And every Tuesday, he added, his voice dropping to a low, final, devastating whisper, your own father, Harrison Blackwood, would meet here, at this very table, with a series of local politicians, to negotiate the terms of his fraudulent, multi-million-dollar public works contracts. Victoria finally found her voice, but it came out as a desperate, choked whisper. My father. You have something against my father. Daniel and Agent Washington exchanged a brief, meaningful glance. Ms. Blackwood, Agent Washington said, softly, his voice now full of a quiet, somber gravity, your father is being arrested, at this very moment, in his office, along with your brother, Theodore, along with Marcus Hoffman, and along with 8 other senior corporate employees of Blackwood Industries. Victoria's world, her entire gilded, privileged, untouchable world, collapsed in that single, shattering instant. Blackwood Industries, the mighty, formidable empire that her family had built over for decades, was being systematically, surgically, dismantled, while she, its pampered, arrogant heiress, was busy humiliating a waiter because of the color of his skin. The operation was coordinated to happen simultaneously. Daniel explained, checking the time on his simple, functional watch. While you and I have been having this conversation here, multiple FBI teams have been executing search and seizure warrants on 12 different Blackwood family properties. Offices, residences, warehouses, everything is being searched and seized as we speak. It can't be, Victoria murmured, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her cell phone. She pulled it out of her now infamous Hermes bag. The screen was a chaotic, flashing nightmare of notifications. 43 missed calls from her father's office, 17 desperate, frantic text messages from her personal assistant, and a series of breaking news alerts from every major news organization in the country, all of them with a variation of the same devastating headline, FBI and massive raid on Blackwood Industries, CEO Harrison Blackwood arrested. But it can, Daniel said, his professional courtesy now tinged with a faint, almost imperceptible, but deeply satisfying, note of triumph. And you know what else? During all these months of being treated like an invisible, insignificant object by people like you, I've learned something very important. The true arrogance of the powerful isn't just in how you treat your employees. It's in the absolute, unshakable belief that you are too smart, too powerful, too important, to ever get caught. Agent Washington stepped closer, his presence now filling the space, his authority absolute. Ms. Blackwood, he said, his voice now firm, official, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us for questioning. There are a great many questions we need to clear up about your own personal involvement in the company's operations. Involvement? Victoria tried to protest, her voice a weak, pathetic squeak. I didn't know anything. I didn't participate in any of the crimes. Daniel chuckled softly, a low, quiet sound that echoed in a tense, silent restaurant like a death knell. That's interesting, he said, because in the recordings we have of your own phone conversations court authorized, of course you discussed in great and very specific detail with your father how to pressure those poor, rural minority communities through a series of fabricated, fraudulent lawsuits to sell their ancestral lands for pennies on the dollar. The final, devastating revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. Her own words, her own criminal decisions, all of it had been captured, documented, and was now in the hands of the federal government. There was no escape. There was no denial possible. The beauty of justice, Daniel said, adjusting his tie one last time, a final, symbolic gesture of his transformation from waiter to agent, is that it often works best when those who most despise it feel too secure, too arrogant, to bother hiding their crimes. You and your family, Miss Blackwood, you built an empire based on the absolute certainty that you were untouchable. Today you are discovering that no one at all, is above the law. The other customers in the restaurant watched in a stunned, absolute silence as Agent Washington discreetly signaled to two other agents, who had entered, unnoticed, through the front door. Victoria Blackwood, the heiress to a $23 billion fortune, was about to discover that all of her money, all of her power, all of her privilege, could not buy her freedom. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that the worst was yet to come. Because while she thought she had lost only her money, her status, her freedom, Special Agent Daniel Santos was about to reveal that her own racist, arrogant actions, on this very night, had been broadcast, lived to far more people than she could ever, in her wildest nightmares, have imagined, including the very people who would now determine not only her legal fate, but her social and personal future forever. Live broadcast, Victoria repeated, a voice a desperate, uncomprehending whisper as the two agents gently, but firmly, took her by the arms. What live broadcast? Daniel smiled, a soft, almost sad, smile. He removed the small, sophisticated microphone from the inside pocket of his shirt, the one that had been clipped, invisibly, to his tie. This microphone, Miss Blackwood, he explained, his voice now full of a quiet, somber gravity, was not just recording for our internal evidence files. It was connected directly to a live feed on the FBI's official social media networks. He paused, letting the full, horrifying weight of his words sink in. Every racist word, every arrogant threat, every disgusting display of class supremacy that you have uttered in the last 40 minutes has been broadcast, in real time, to an audience of over 200,000 people, and growing. Victoria's blood ran cold. She felt a wave of nausea so profound, so overwhelming, that she thought she might faint. Agent Washington nodded, his expression grim. It's a new protocol, he explained, his voice devoid of any emotion. For operations of significant public interest, we find that transparency is a very powerful tool. The public has a right to see how certain people of great power and influence, use their privilege to perpetuate injustice. No, Victoria whispered, her voice a raw, ragged sound of pure animal despair. No, it can't be. She fumbled for her phone again, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The screen was a chaotic, exploding supernova of notifications, mentions, comments, shares. The video of the live broadcast had already surpassed 500,000 views on 3 different platforms. #Blackwood racist, Daniel reported calmly, as if he were reading from a stock ticker, is now the #1 trending topic in the entire country. Your statements about people like me and places like this are currently being analyzed and condemned by civil rights experts, by social commentators, by politicians, on national television. Victoria, her eyes wide with a horror that was beyond comprehension, read some of the comments that were flying across her screen. Racist billionaire humiliates FBI agent posing as waiter. Shocking video. Heiress reveals true colors in vile rant at luxury restaurant. Blackwood Industries, family, business, or criminal organization. The irony, Daniel continued, his voice still quiet, still calm, is that every single word you used to try and belittle me, to try and diminish me, was being documented not just for our criminal case, but for the court of public opinion, for all of America, for the entire world. As we speak, major corporations are already issuing press releases, canceling their contracts with Blackwood Industries, based solely on what they have witnessed you do and say, here tonight. Richard Payton, the manager who had been watching the entire surreal scene unfold from a safe distance, now understood that he was witnessing not just the arrest of a powerful woman, but the complete, public, real-time collapse of one of the most powerful corporate dynasties in the entire country. Other customers in the restaurant, who had been discreetly watching the live feed on their own phones, now whispered among themselves, their faces a mixture of shock, disgust, and a certain, undeniable schadenfreude. But that's not all, Ms. Blackwood, Agent Washington added, his voice grim, relentless. While we have been talking here, prosecutors in 3 different states, prosecutors who have been watching this live broadcast, have already issued arrest warrants for you, and for your father, based on the evidence we have gathered, and on your own public, and very incriminating, statements. Your family's empire will be dismantled, completely. Victoria tried to call her father again, a last, desperate, reflexive act. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried Theodore, her brother, same result. She tried Marcus Hoffman, the accountant. The line was dead. One by one, every single powerful contact who could have saved her, who could have pulled strings, who could have made this all go away, was inaccessible. They were all in federal custody, and thanks to today's live broadcast, Daniel explained softly, his voice now tinged with a faint, almost imperceptible note of satisfaction. Public opinion has already formed its opinion of the moral character of the entire Blackwood family. There will be no sympathy for you. There will be no leniency. Victoria's cell phone began to ring incessantly, a shrill, mocking sound in the NOS silent restaurant. It was a cacophony of calls from journalists, from television producers, from civil rights activists, all of them wanting a statement, a comment, about the viral video that was now being called the humiliation at lapel. Each ring was another hammer blow, sealing her social, her professional, and her personal fate. You ruined my life, she whispered, the tears finally beginning to run down her perfectly made-up face, carving clean, pale tracks through her expensive foundation. Actually, Daniel replied, adjusting his tie one last time, a final, symbolic gesture of a job well done. You ruined your own life. We just documented it. He looked at her, his eyes now full of a quiet, sad wisdom. For 3 months, your family, your associates, all of you confessed to your crimes, out loud, in public, because you believed that the black waiters, the Hispanic busboys, the people you considered to be invisible, were too insignificant to matter. You were wrong. Agent Washington signaled discreetly, and the 2 agents who had been standing patiently at her side, now gently, but firmly, began to escort her towards the door. Victoria Blackwood, the heiress to a $23 billion fortune, was about to discover that all of her money, all of her power, could not buy back her reputation, could not erase the video, could not reverse the broadcast that had shown her, in all her cruel, raw, and prejudiced glory, to the entire world. Wait, Victoria pleaded, her voice a desperate, pathetic cry, as she was being led away. She grabbed Daniel's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. You don't understand. I can change. I can make donations. I can support causes. I can make up for it. Daniel looked down at her hand on his arm, at her perfectly manicured diamond-encrusted fingers, and then he looked up, into her desperate, terrified eyes. Ma'am, he said, his voice quiet, but firm. For 40 minutes you treated me as if I were your property, as if I were less than human. Now, faced with the consequences of your own actions, you want to negotiate. You want to buy your way out of it. This only confirms, he added, his voice a soft, final, devastating whisper, that you do not, in fact, truly understand the gravity of what you have done. She was escorted away, her walk of shame through the hushed, watching dining room of La Pearl restaurant documented from a dozen different angles by the cell phone cameras of the other diners. The images would be all over the internet within minutes, adding more fuel to the media firestorm she had so arrogantly, so foolishly, created. The beauty of modern justice, Daniel murmured to Agent Washington, as they watched Victoria being led away into the flashing lights of the waiting press corps, is that it no longer just takes place in quiet, closed courtrooms. It happens in real time, in front of witnesses, from all around the world. What Victoria didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine in her state of profound, soul-crushing shock, was that Special Agent Daniel Santos had saved the most devastating, most personal revelation for last. Because while she thought she had lost only her money, her status, her freedom, she was about to discover that her own actions, on this very night, would trigger social changes that would forever alter the way that billion-dollar companies treat their employees, and that the young, black waiter she had so viciously, so publicly, despised, had a personal story, a personal connection to her family's crimes, that would make his quiet, methodical and brilliant revenge even more poetic, even more complete, and even more just. 6 months later, Special Agent Daniel Santos stood at the window of his new office at the FBI headquarters in New York, finalizing the last report on the case that would forever be known as Operation Golden Facade. Through the window, he watched the endless, bustling energy of the city, a city that had just a few months prior witnessed one of the most spectacular and most public falls from grace in modern American business history. Blackwood Industries had been completely and systematically dismantled. Harrison Blackwood Sr., the patriarch, the titan, had been sentenced to 23 years in a federal prison for racketeering, money laundering, and massive tax fraud. His son, Theodore Jr., had received a 16-year sentence for insider trading and conspiracy. The accountant, Marcus Hoffman, had been sentenced to 15 years for falsifying federal documents and obstruction of justice. And Victoria Blackwood, the proud, arrogant heiress who had so cruelly humiliated Daniel that night at Lapel, had received the heaviest sentence of all, 25 years, for aggravated hate crimes, for extortion, for money laundering, and for obstruction of justice. The viral video of her racist, classist outburst had been the star exhibit in her trial, demonstrating to the jury, beyond any reasonable doubt, her character, her motivations, and her predisposition to crimes motivated by a deep and ugly prejudice. The live broadcast changed everything, Daniel explained to a group of new, young FBI agents in a training session. It wasn't just about documenting the financial crimes. It was about showing society, in real time, how systemic racism, how classism works at the very highest, most powerful levels of our society. What Daniel had never revealed publicly, what he had kept as his own private, quiet motivation, was his own personal connection to the case. 20 years earlier, when he was only 6 years old, his own family had been one of the poor, rural families who had been evicted from their small farm in the countryside, after Blackwood Industries had bought up all the surrounding land through a series of fraudulent, coercive court proceedings. His father, an honest, hard-working black farmer, had lost the land that had supported 3 generations of the Santos family. The stress of the eviction, of the bankruptcy, of the profound, crushing injustice of it all, had caused the massive heart attack that had killed his father at the age of 40-2. Daniel had grown up in urban poverty, raised by a strong, resilient mother who had worked double shifts as a domestic worker to pay for his education, to give him a chance at a better life. Every racist word that Victoria Blackwood uttered that night, Daniel continued, his voice, quiet but firm as he spoke to the new agents, it echoed to decades of injustices that my own family, and so many other families like mine, had suffered in silence. But instead of seeking personal revenge, I chose to channel that pain, that anger, into serving a greater, more impartial justice. The operation had resulted in the recovery of over $450 million in criminal assets. That money, in a landmark legal decision, had been redistributed to the very communities, the rural families, the minority groups, that the Blackwood Corporation had harmed over the course of decades. The Santos family was one of the beneficiaries. They had received the deed to their ancestral lands back, along with a substantial financial compensation that had allowed Daniel's mother to finally retire with the dignity and the security she so richly deserved. Victoria, who had once owned lavish mansions in 5 different states, now shared a 2x4-meter cell with a prisoner who was serving time for drug trafficking. Her $23 billion inheritance had been completely and irrevocably confiscated by the Internal Revenue Service. She had no assets. She had no influential contacts. She had no power to buy the best, most ruthless, elite lawyers. The irony. Daniel allowed himself a small, discreet smile, is that she is currently incarcerated in the very same state prison where my own cousin was unjustly convicted 10 years ago for a crime he did not commit. The same corrupt system that she and her family helped to maintain, to perpetuate, is now prosecuting her with the full and unforgiving force of the law. Richard Payton, the manager of La Pearl, had been promoted to general manager of the entire restaurant group after his brave and honest testimony against Victoria during the trial. The restaurant itself had experienced a 300% increase in patronage, with people from all over the world visiting specifically to see the place where social justice had been served, lived for the whole world to see. The story had also inspired significant, and long overdue, legislative changes. The United States Congress had passed the Santos Bill, a new piece of legislation that established much harsher penalties for crimes of discrimination in commercial establishments, and that created a new federal fund to protect and support workers who are the victims of racial or class-based harassment by powerful, influential customers. You have to understand, Daniel told the new, rapt agents, that the real victory wasn't just seeing Victoria Blackwood go to prison, it was in discovering that my own dignity, my own self-worth, was never for sale, not even when she tried to buy it, to crush it, with her public humiliation. Agent Washington, his supervisor who was observing the training session from the back of the room, nodded proudly. Daniel Santos had received 3 promotions in 6 short months. He had become the youngest agent in the history of the FBI to head his own economic crimes division. Universities from Harvard to Stanford were vying to have him come and give lectures on his case, which had now become a benchmark, a classic case study, in law schools and business schools across the country. The biggest lesson, Daniel concluded, as he organized the final files of the now closed Blackwood case, is that those who try to diminish others, those who try to make others feel small, always reveal more about their own weaknesses, about their own insecurities, than they do about the people they are attacking. Victoria thought she was proving her superiority. In fact, she was just documenting her own destruction. Today, Victoria Blackwood wakes up at 5 a.m. in a federal prison. She cleans toilets for $2 a day, and she eats her meals, which are prepared by cooks who earn less in an entire year than she once spent on a single crocodile skin purse. And Daniel Santos wakes up in his own sunlit apartment in Manhattan. He directs investigations that protect millions of ordinary Americans from the predations of the powerful, and he inspires a new generation of young, black men and women to never, ever, accept being treated as inferior. She tried to teach me my place, Daniel murmured to himself, as he put away the last document from the case that had defined his career and had, in a strange, poetic way, redeemed his family's long history of pain. She ended up learning hers. The best revenge, he now knew, was not to stoop to the level of those who try to put us down. It is to rise so high, on the wings of our own competence, our own integrity, our own dignity, that they can no longer reach us to hurt us, ever again.